Thinking about religion in a globalizing world leads me to the topic of how religion has power in the globalizing world. How does religion find a way of expressing its values? How does religion find a way of influencing outcomes? In international affairs more generally, over time, historically and in the present day, material characteristics of power are very often influenced, whether it be financial power or military power or the threat or use of force. These are all well-known components of how actors emphasize their capacity to influence outcomes in international affairs. Religion, of course, doesn't have such obviously material characteristics which enable it to influence outcomes in the same way. We never think about, for example, religious armies or the power of money linked to religion. So religion has a capacity to influence outcomes in other ways. And I will refer to this as religious soft power. The idea that religion can influence outcomes without having the material characteristics of many influential actors in international relations. One way to come at this, one way to think about this, is to think about the end of the Cold War in the late 1980s and the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. The Soviet Union was, of course, one of the world's global superpowers. It was seen as a match for the United States. Both countries were major military machines with nuclear weapons and other key components of military power. Yet the Soviet Union collapsed very quickly in ways which were entirely unanticipated by international affairs specialists. The United States didn't defeat the Soviet Union militarily, yet the Soviet Union collapsed easily. How can this be explained? One often encountered explanation for the demise of the Soviet Union was the power of religion to influence outcomes, and specifically in Poland, where the Soviet Union had been in control since the late 1940s, where a communist government had been in power since that time, where religion had been an important social force yet deprived of power in the public realm. The ability of communism to survive under the influence of the return of religion in Poland was clearly not very strong. In the late 1970s, there was a Polish Pope who was received with great acclaim in Poland during his successive tours of Poland in the late 1970s and early 80s. And over time, the iconic example of Poland, with its return of religion to public prominence, and the capacity of religion to influence political outcomes, became of major significance in a wider context in the Soviet Union. My point then is that religion can be a major force for change without having many of the material capacities that we associate with the ability to influence change in international affairs. It doesn't have the hard power of armies, it doesn't have the hard power of finance. Yet the ideas that religion conveys can be a major attribute of change in international affairs, particularly in this era of globalisation. The wider context of the shift of power and emphasis in Poland, and over time in terms of the Soviet Union as well, came in the wake of the growing influence of the Catholic Church in social justice issues in the global context from the mid-1960s. So we can see a growing influence of one particular form of religion in global affairs from the mid-60s, with a focus on social justice and social change in many ways, which influenced outcomes in Poland and by extension in the Soviet Union. My claim is not that there's a simple cause and effect here, but my claim is simply that the ideas that religion conveys can be world-changing in their capacity to shift power from one place to another. And I'd like to suggest 4 ways in which religious soft power is apparent in the context of post Cold War globalisation. If we think about any of the world faiths, any of the 5 world faiths, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism and Hinduism, we can pinpoint where those faiths began. They generally began with a founder of the religion in a specific geographical location. Each of the world faiths, by definition, is now a global faith, which over hundreds or if not thousands of years has spread from the place where they were founded to become represented in virtually every country in the world. So religion has the capacity, if it's successful, to move from place to place, and as it advances, as it grows geographically, it has the capacity to bring in people of different cultures, different ethnicities, different races, into an umbrella of faith which characterises their worldviews in a significant way. What globalisation tends to do in that respect is to emphasise that communities of religious believers are not isolated, singular groups, but they are in a wider global context where there are innumerable different groups represented. So over time, globalisation has encouraged religions to be expansive in ways that in the past they weren't so encouraged to be. So when religion begins in a particular geographical location, it adopts the characteristics of that culture representing that geographical location. But as a religion spreads, it needs to be flexible, it needs to be adaptive, it needs to respond to some of the challenges that it will face when encountering different cultural contexts. Where globalisation comes in this regard is to enable people to encounter different sets of ideas. Very often people are born into a religion and they die in a religion. Their capacity for choice is inherently limited by their cultural surroundings. Globalisation encourages, or at least offers the opportunity for people to encounter different sets of religious ideas. Now this is not to say, of course, that because a person comes across different ideas, they will necessarily be influenced by those ideas and change their religion as a result. But it does mean that the conditions of globalisation encourage more reflection on what one's own religious worldview is, and perhaps encourages us to compare our own religion with others. It's that the ideas are made much more apparent to us, maybe competing ideas, even conflicting ideas linked to a religious worldview are made more clear to us by the effect of globalisation compared to the past. So one of the key components of religious soft power in the context of globalisation is how do religions compete with each other in what some have called a global religious marketplace of ideas. If one third of the world's people, something like 2.5 billion people, now have regular access to the internet, this is one way of expressing the enormous amount of ideas and different worldviews that people can come across just by looking into what's available on the internet. And where this affects religion is largely that people's capacity to make choices about religion is enhanced by the context and the conditions of globalisation. The second area that I want to comment on is the notion of religious experiences in the era of globalisation. The history of religion and the history of religious expansion is often linked to tensions, even conflict between religious groups. As religions spread geographically, they may come into contact with other religious groups, and that may not be a harmonious experience necessarily. It may It may be that proselytization works and that people are convinced to peacefully change from one religion to another. It may be that different forms of persuasion are used. In the context of globalization and the expansiveness of religious ideas which are increasingly encountered, there are growing opportunities to experience other religions, whether in real time or whether via the internet and other forms of knowledge dissemination. So globalization encourages increased experiences with different religious traditions. It may be that this is an opportunity for cooperation, for a shared perspective to develop, but it may be also a context for less harmonious relations between groups. So the second dimension of religion linked to globalization that I want to emphasize is the way in which religious experiences are increased during the conditions of globalization, which may or may not be harmonious. They can lead to more tensions. And one of the ways in which many people regard the intrusion of religion into global affairs is in a way which can emphasize growing tension rather than reductions of tension. So the ways in which we experience other religious faiths during the era of globalization may or may not be leading to more cooperation. It can lead to more conflict too. One of the ways this can be illustrated is by the understanding among some people that Western ideas, Westernization more generally, is a way of undermining people's own worldviews. That globalization tends to make ideas spread further than they would have done without globalization, via electronic means primarily. And this can mean that we can experience a different culture or a different set of ideas linked to a culture, which can affect how we see the world more generally. And we can see this as perhaps a threat to our own well-being and to our own religious values. The third area I wanted to emphasize is the way that religious practices can change as a result of globalization. It's often suggested that religions have a core list of components which make them what they are, that they follow certain practices which make them the religions they are, which makes them distinct and different from other religious faiths. That may be more true in theory than in practice. There is a great deal of evidence which suggests that over time religious practices develop and change, and that the core components of a religious practice are actually quite fluctuating. They may differ from place to place, even under the same religious rubric. And it may well be that under the conditions of globalization, the practices associated with the religious faith do change more than they would have done without the impact of globalization. It's because people can learn about different practices and they wish to adopt them and adapt them to their own set of circumstances, even though they retain the same religious worldview. So globalization offers opportunities to develop existing religious practices which can lead to changes within those practices. And it isn't necessarily the case that only religious worldviews can change those religious practices. It could be, for example, that individual religions become more or less concerned with gender equality, or with equality more generally, as a result of the ideas expressed not because of globalization, but via globalization. That the access of ideas can lead to changing religious practices in ways which is unexpected, although not, of course, there is no uniformity here. It isn't necessarily the case that because religious traditions experience ideas, they necessarily change their practices as a result. but it may well be that those practices do change over time. An example I would emphasise in this regard is in the ways in which Catholicism, the Roman Catholic Church, and its teachings have developed in Latin America over the last 20 or 30 years. The region has seen the growth of evangelical Protestant churches of various kinds, which have been very successful in capturing followers. People have changed their religious worldview from a Catholic influence worldview to an evangelical Protestant worldview. And it isn't necessarily because those religious faiths change in terms of their understandings. It's because many Latin Americans see a value in evangelical Protestantism, which they no longer see in Catholicism. So there could be services involving a great deal of interaction between the followers of the religion and a sense of community which people don't necessarily get from a Catholic church service in some places. The Catholic Church has responded by emphasising its community and dynamic experiences in a way which is following the evangelical church as a way of emphasising the relevance and importance of Catholic practices to people who are culturally Catholic. So this is a way in which the practices of the Catholic Church in Latin America are being amended due to the introduction of a foreign religion, often an American-based churches, evangelical Protestant churches, which have changed the practices of the Catholic Church. I think it's a good example of how religious practices can change as a result of globalisation, because people may be born into religious faith, but once they begin to question, if they do begin to question their worldview, and they can well question their religious identity. And with a lot of different forms of religion on offer, as it were, in this religious marketplace, people can then choose to move to an expression of religious faith which is more in keeping with their own perceptions of their world and their place within it. So religions have to respond to these challenges, and this is one of the ways in which globalisation emphasises how religion needs to react to a very dynamic process of exchange of ideas within religious contexts. It's certainly the case that religions, I think, find themselves challenged to respond to globalisation in ways which in the past they weren't challenged. And this, I think, is largely because people now, in many cases, see the capacity to shift from one faith to another in ways which before globalisation they may not have seen as a viable or even desirable thing to do. The fourth component of religion and globalisation I want to emphasise now is the growth in religious organisations. We can see this empirically. There's plenty of evidence to say that the last 30 or 40 years have seen almost exponential growth of organisations with links to religion, which have, in many cases, a great deal of interest in issues beyond religion. So on the one hand, it's a way of saying that a religious worldview can stimulate wider concerns with broadly social justice issues in both domestic and international context. But it's also the case that growing numbers of religious organisations see it as almost as a duty to try to be in a position to influence outcomes. So there's a growing interest in general and a specific interest in seeking to influence outcomes broadly in the social justice area. And this is a phenomenon which I think is closely linked to globalisation. Religions have become more concerned with issues beyond their religious faith. Why this is the case, I think, is largely explicable by the conditions that globalisation produces. We are, in general, whether religious people or not, much more aware of global concerns now compared to the past. It's almost impossible to ignore issues which are of global prominence. And one way in which that is expressed in recent decades is by growing concerns with achieving greater social justice than is currently in place. So I think that while there are many different forms of religious organisation, whether it be small scale, localised or large scale and internationalised, there is a shared tendency to look beyond a religious set of religious parameters to be concerned about issues which obviously have a religious dimension. Social justice is a key concern for most religious faiths. But what is new and what is linked to globalisation, I think, is a desire to take this beyond the area of reflection to think about ways in which religious organisations can actually be part of a decision-making process. Now, of course, decision-making is largely carried out within countries. Yet most countries are secular, certainly in the Western world. So there isn't necessarily existing mechanisms whereby religious organisations can influence outcomes. So one thing that has been notable in recent years, not because of globalisation, but clearly globalisation facilitates this happening, is for prominent religious organisations to be linked to regional and international organisations in the context of global governance. And it's probably the case that the key issue, if there is a commonality to be observed, key issue is in regard to social development and human rights on the one hand, and conflict resolution on the other hand. So there's been a growing involvement of numerous religious organisations in efforts to achieve improved outcomes, broadly in these areas: social development, human rights, and conflict resolution. It's very difficult to judge the extent to which there's success or failure in this regard, though. There is, of course, an argument which says that you can only say resolve conflicts or develop societies when there is a more generalised will to achieve those objectives. So on the one hand, there are more religious organisations involved in attempts to improve outcomes within the world. There's improved context where they can work to try to make this happen. There's increased concern with listening to such religious groups' concerns. We can't say, I don't think, that the end result has been growing success in terms of resolving such problems, but it would be very difficult to know whether there's more success or less success, because we have no sort of benchmark to work from to make those kinds of judgments. But it is important, I think, to emphasise that one of the key ways in which religious organisations in the context of globalisation now work is in various ways in which they will seek to act with others to improve outcomes. Now, it's very difficult to generalise amongst religious groups, because we must recognise that there are many hundreds of thousands, if not more, groups which could be labelled as religious organisations. And clearly not all of those groups are singing from the same song sheet when it comes to seeking harmonious outcomes to perceive shared problems. But I think it's generalisable enough to make it a key observation that religious groups now work in ways to improve outcomes in an expansive global environment, which has changed as a result of the impact of globalisation. I think it depends upon a shared realisation from both religious and non-religious people that the concerns we face are too large to be addressed by one single actor, or even by a group of states maybe, but they require concerted collective imagination and organisation to try to come up with solutions which are acceptable in a broad sense in a global context. It's the case that the last 2 or 3 decades have seen growing numbers of of formal environments where religious people seek to address such concerns. There is growing interfaith dialogue. There are growing interfaith attempts to deal with conflict. Some conflicts are indeed resolved by the involvement of faith leaders. Other conflicts are not so open to be resolved in that way. So my observation is not that religion makes all the difference. That when religion seeks to address collective concerns, it necessarily has an effect of improving outcomes. But it is to observe that religion has become much more centrally placed to try to affect outcomes, and that religious leaders very often work together in ways to achieve those outcomes, in ways which 2 or 3 decades ago was not the case. It's not only linked to globalisation, of course, but it is to emphasise that the conditions that globalisation offers encourages religious leaders in particular to meet together to try to resolve conflict. But the other side of that equation, of course, is religious leaders can meet, they can talk, they can observe, they can make decisions. Where does it go from there? So there has to be a link to wider decision-making bodies, whether it be governments or other forms of political power in the world, for this coming together of religious leaders in a shared pursuit of improved outcomes. There has to be a way of expressing that in a global governance environment, so that religion isn't just another voice, it's a voice that has an influence on outcomes, and that is very difficult to achieve. Governments are wary of religious leaders. They'll listen to them, but do they necessarily take them into account? International organisations are wary of religious leaders. They will listen to them, but do they take them into account? Regional organisations are wary of religious leaders. They will listen to them, but do they take them into account? So perhaps the final comment is that even though religion is now, in a broad sense, addressing concerns and has a wider perspective about how concerns can be resolved in the world, the final piece of the jigsaw is still missing. How does religion have the capacity consistently to influence decision making? And that has not been changed by the development of globalisation over time. Religion has a voice. Religion may be even singing the same song now, but it doesn't have the capacity to influence secular decision makers in a consistent way. And that's maybe the next stage of the next question to address in terms of global governance and decision making.